I was probably the one who first heard about Hidden Valley. It was mid-February, a grueling time of year for a tax accountant. The long hours, deadlines, and pressure to pay attention to line after line of numbers can become overwhelming. And when you add to that the gloomy, drizzly weather of the Pacific Northwest this time of year, life just becomes miserable. Gina was under pressure too. She was the manager of the Portland branch of a national furniture and DC core retailer. Her district manager was constantly reporting to her about daily sales figures, new credit card openings, and lower labor costs. All of this work-related stress was taking its toll on our relationship. We hadn't had a fun activity in weeks. I know that this pressure has taken a toll on our lives. In addition, over the past year, Gina has put on weight. Her long work hours have drastically cut into her gym time. If you start skipping workouts, it quickly becomes a habit. It was during this dark period of our lives that I first heard about Hidden Valley Farm. One day at lunch, one of the guys in our office, Tim Merchant, brought it up. My sister and her husband joined her and they really like the place, said Tim. They talk about the fresh air, the lack of stress, and the community they create. Compared to this shit. And he slammed his hand down on a folder of tax documents he was holding. It sounds like paradise. Is that place in southern Oregon, near Grants Pass? Asked Neil, another guy from our office. Tim nodded affirmatively as he ate. I read somewhere about a leader, some genius in microbiology or something, suggested Neil. Tim swallowed and continued. The guy's name is Simon Brand, and you're right. He has some kind of advanced degree in biology. My sister says they're in Hidden Valley to escape the toxic lifestyle they were living in the city. This Brand guy has a whole philosophy. I have to say, compared to all this, it sounds tempting. Tom nodded toward the window, one of the many homeless people parading down the sidewalk with a cart full of his worldly possessions. At that moment, Tim and Neil mention the Zoom call they have to attend and get up to leave. I noticed the flyer about Hidden Valley Farm that Tim left behind. It was an informational meeting in a nearby conference room today at 5:30. I read through it. It sounded pretty interesting. I knew Gina was closed today, so she wouldn't be home until 8 p.m. As I left, I grabbed the flyer and wondered, maybe I'd stop by. What would be the risk of that? I went to the meeting. The speaker was a normal-looking, clean-shaven, outgoing, smiling type, about my age, early 30s. He talked about the beauty and simplicity of Hidden Valley Farm, without much detail, just in generalities. And then he compared it to city life, the pressures of work, the financial pressures, the pressures of living in a city like Portland, and how all of these factors can poison your life and your relationships. It was like Rick opened my mind and saw what I was experiencing. And then, at first, I thought it might be one of those cults that takes all your money. It sounded different. 1. You had to qualify to be accepted. 2. You then bought shares of the farm. They had a whole brochure. You became the owner and the shares were your property. Theoretically, you could sell them. And finally, number 3. The HVF representative was a normal guy, not some weirdo. He looked like he could have been a friend or a neighbor. At the end of the presentation, Rick handed out questionnaires to everyone. If you want to know more about our plan, just answer a couple questions and give the questionnaire to me as you leave. If it's not for you, no problem. No pressure. As he handed me the form, he looked me in the eye and nodded slightly in acknowledgement. He seemed to be sincere. The form had a few questions about you. Whether you were married, whether you had children, where you lived, whether you owned your own home, what you did for a living, etc. It even asked what your income was in a pretty broad sense. Pretty personal, but in my opinion, not overstepping the bounds of permissible. Also asked for an email address. As I left, I handed over my card. I hope to talk to you again, Rick said, patting me lightly on the shoulder as I left. On the way home, I pondered how good this could be for Gina and I, or whether I was crazy to even consider such a drastic change in our lifestyle. One thing I knew for sure, something had to change for us. The pressures of our jobs were suffocating our relationship. On the drive home, I thought back to the first time I met Gina. I was a track and field athlete at the University of Oregon. I was good, but not outstanding. As a junior, I placed 4th in the 1,500-meter run at the PSC 12 championships. I also ran on the 4x400 relay, and my senior year we placed 2nd in the PSC 12. Some kids can go pro in track and field, but I wasn't at that level. My scholarship paid for my college tuition. I studied business and ended up getting a bachelor's degree in accounting. As an athlete, I had the opportunity to live in the dorms for athletes. These were small apartments rather than dorm rooms. Many of them, including mine, had a private bathroom. It was a great place to live as an athlete. When I first met Gina, she was dating another athlete, a basketball player named Reggie Lake. I had seen Reggie in the dorms and on campus, but I didn't know him. Reggie was one of those guys who could score 30 points one night and 4 the next. Regardless, he kept shooting. What Reggie lacked in consistency, he made up for in confidence. He had a big mouth and was constantly talking both on and off the basketball court. He had a kind of cocky charisma about him that often crossed the line and became obnoxious. I met Gina at a party. I knew she was dating Reggie, but he wasn't around at the time. Gina was my type. I introduced myself. "Warner West," I said, and we shook hands. Both of us had big smiles on our faces. There seemed to be some chemistry between us. When I told her where I lived, she asked if I played sports, and I told her I was on the track team. Unlike basketball and soccer players, other athletes in Oregon didn't have the same celebrity status. We were having a great conversation when suddenly there was a loud noise, and soon everyone realized that Reggie had arrived. I saw Gina look a little nervously in the direction of the noise. I better go," she said. I looked her in the eye, shook her hand, holding it a little longer than necessary, and said, "It's very nice to meet you, Gina." She looked back. At that moment, Reggie walked up in all his glory. He grabbed Gina's hand. "Let's go," he barked at her. I looked at Gina, and she was staring adoringly at Reggie. Then I looked at Reggie, and he was staring at me with undisguised defiance. I held my gaze on him for a few moments, and then looked at Gina again. She was readily dragged along behind her by a grinning Reggie. As they left, she continued to stare at him with a satisfied expression on her face as he dragged her through the crowd at the party. I didn't realize anything. I had just had a great conversation with a woman who I thought was smart, interesting, and confident. The woman being led around by the basketball player, on the other hand, looked insecure and weak. Thinking about it later, I felt that Gina and I had made a connection. Her adoring look at Reggie was so out of keeping with the cold, intelligent girl I was beginning to recognize. Whatever, I thought at the time. It was probably 2 years after graduation when I met Gina again in downtown Portland. I was meeting a few people from the office after work for drinks. She was with a group of people who were doing the same thing. Although our interaction in college had been brief, my initial impressions of her were mostly very positive, and I liked the way she looked. I was drawn to her. At a bar with my buddies, I kept Gina and her band in sight using a bar mirror. At one point, I saw her get up and head to the restroom. I abruptly pulled away from my buddies and made sure our trajectories would cross at the small bar. "Gina?" I said, with a fake surprised expression on my face. She looked up at me with the rudiments of a beautiful smile, but with a puzzled expression. She opened her mouth to greet me, but clearly didn't know who I was. "Warner West from U of O," I reintroduced myself to her. The seeds of recognition began to sprout in her, but she still didn't understand who I was. "We met at an all-student party. You told me about your goal to become an interior decorator." I said this with what I hoped was a warm smile. Maybe it was my voice, or maybe she really did recognize me, but suddenly she went around my arm and hugged me tightly. "Warner, of course," she said. "How are you doing? You live in Portland?" she asked. And we raced off, catching up with each other. We both left our original companions and ended up at a small table, chatting into the evening. We figured out all the details. She lived in Portland, was an interior designer, and worked at a high-end furniture store. I told her I worked as a tax accountant for the regional accounting firm of Eccles and Meyer. Looks like Reggie was long gone. In fact, if I understood correctly, he may have dumped her shortly after I first met her at the party. At any rate, from what I understood, she was single at the moment. That was good news. I walked her home and wasn't invited inside. But I did get her phone number and a promise that we would meet up the following weekend. We started dating. My initial feelings that there was a connection between us strengthened. I saw a confident, fun, funny, intelligent woman again. Almost all thoughts of her being insecure and dependent were gone. I was living with my cousin Shasta. Or rather, Shasta was living in my house and paying rent. Shasta was a couple years older than me and was the daughter of my father's sister. She had some problems growing up. Shasta was a nice person, but a little rough. She had dropped out of high school, but had gotten her GED. The guys she socialized with were questionable. When I got home that night and saw the motorcycle in the driveway, I realized she had company. I think I've met this guy before, I thought as I entered the house. Black leather jacket, big, with a long black beard. Hey, Warren, you remember Zeke, don't you? Asked Shasta. Zeke, I nodded in greeting toward the big guy. Immediately, I smelled the odor. Shasta, I asked you not to smoke in the house. I hated to punish her, but I had a few rules, and smoking in the house was forbidden. After all, it was my house. Listen, bro, Zeke intervened. I'm going to turn on the fan. Chill out. He held out his hands, palms up, with a half smile on his face. This was my house. I had a few rules, and this guy was telling me to chill? No, you listen, Zeke. I turned to him and addressed him sharply. In your house or wherever you live, you can do whatever you want. Smoke, relax, whatever. But it's my house. I pay the utilities, taxes, insurance, and mortgage. That gives me the right to make the rules. I don't have many, but this is one of them. If it doesn't suit you, you have other options. Do we understand each other? He just stared at me, squinting his eyes. The smile and pleading pose were gone. He only nodded slightly in acknowledgement, but there was no trace of the simmering hostility on the surface. I'm sorry, Warner, Shasta cut in. I nodded at her, moving to another part of the house. I bought this house from my parents. It used to be rented out. It was old with a detached garage. I was working on a project to convert the garage into an ADU, accessory dwelling unit. All I had to do was finish the bathroom. Honestly, the money from Shasta's rent was needed to cover all the expenses around the house. The next weekend, Gina and I spent in Astoria. Astoria is in the far northwest corner of the state. Astoria is a revitalized historic city with a rich history, museums, monuments, and landmarks. We did not see any of these historic sites. Our time was dedicated to each other. Were there any negative aspects? The only thing I could recall was a strange relationship in college with Reggie Lake. Why would a woman who had so much to offer be inferior to Reggie, or anyone for that matter? It didn't make sense. For the moment, I wrote it off as an immature college romance. Over the next year, our relationship got better and better. We became close. All thoughts of a college relationship faded away. Over the next year, I planned to propose to her. We had already talked about marriage, and I was sure she wanted it as much as I did. During that year, several things changed. First, she was hired into a management training program at Laguna and 101, a national designer home furnishings company. It was a well-known company that produced a beautiful glossy catalog and sold overpriced furniture and accessories. Second, I completed an apartment over the garage, and Shasta moved into that space. The house was now completely owned by me and Gina. Since Shasta moved into the ADU, Gina essentially moved in with us. Speaking of moving in, it turns out Zeke was almost done. As mentioned, Zeke and I didn't have the best relationship, but my opinion was slowly changing. Unlike the other men in Shasta's life, Zeke seemed set on a long life with Shasta. Plus, he was pretty handy and would occasionally help fix some things around the house. I appreciated that. Eventually, I proposed, and we got married. We honeymooned in Hawaii, staying at the Sheraton Hotel on Poipu Beach on the island of Kauai. We had a magical time on this beautiful island. On the way home, I reflected on how good our life had been. First, we had each other, and we were so right for each other. Second, we each had good jobs, and we were living well. And third, I had a house, and in the current real estate market in Portland, I was very lucky. The future seemed good for us. I couldn't imagine that anything could stand in our way. Back to the present. I returned home that evening after the Hidden Valley Farm presentation, and as expected, Gina was not home. I did, however, notice several other motorcycles, probably choppers, parked next to Zeke's house near the garage. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. I didn't want my property to turn into a motorcycle club hangout, but there wasn't really any problem. I cooked something for dinner and tried to think of something to tell Gina about the Hidden Valley presentation I'd attended. The more I thought about it, the more attractive she seemed. But was I really going crazy thinking it would be a good fit for us? Gina got home a little after 8 in the evening. I asked her how her day had gone. Sales are down from a year ago. I got crap about it from the DM, district manager. Mary Louise, one of my assistant managers, tendered her resignation. She was one of the few people I could rely on. I was also told to take a 10% pay cut. She continued. I knew the mood. It was fragile. I could say the smallest mistake and the accumulated stress and anger could be directed in my direction. I was cautious and simply nodded my support and understanding. When she started up again, describing the perceived shortcomings of her performance, I tried to change the subject or at least steer her in another direction. Would you like a beer? I asked. Safe topic. I tried to be nice. What? Now she was looking at me. Oh, I'd stepped on some kind of verbal landmine and didn't know what it was. I'm explaining the stress of my life, she says, looking at me intently. And you're asking me about beer, she says. Are you listening to me? I still don't know exactly what I did wrong, but even after several years of marriage, I've learned the strategy of the right answer. Say as little as possible. I deserve better in my life than this. I don't need this stress. I don't deserve this, she said. I looked at her, pressed my lips together, and nodded slowly, as if I fully understood the burden of stress she was carrying. I know it was a coward's way out, but I didn't have the energy for any confrontation. Later that evening, I lay in bed and thought about the fun, carefree Gina I had first met. Then I thought about what I wanted out of life in terms of career and lifestyle. It seemed to me that not only were we not achieving our goals in life, but we were not even on the path that could lead us to them. As I fell asleep, I thought about Rick from Hidden Valley Farm and what a great lifestyle he presented in his presentation. Over the next few days, I didn't say anything about HVF, Hidden Valley Farm, to Gina or anyone else. But I kept thinking about it. My dissatisfaction with working at Eccles and Meyer was only getting worse. The closer it got to April 15th, the more the pressure increased. Most weeks Gina had a day off, and we usually tried to get something done on Friday night. This Friday, Gina made a great pasta and shrimp dinner, and we had dinner in the dining room. The bottle of wine was open, and from the looks of it, she had had at least a glass. The mood was much more positive. After dinner, we sat around the table in a cozy silence. After the silence lingered for a bit, I looked over at Gina. She was smiling and looking at me from under her eyebrows, as if there was some kind of inside joke going on between us. What? I asked, with a confused smile on my face. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, still smiling. I didn't know where we were going with this. I had no idea what she was talking about. About what? I asked. I didn't want to disrupt all this positivity, but I was confused. About this, she said, and handed me a glossy brochure, which I quickly ascertained contained information about Hidden Valley Farm. As I read the brochure, I noticed a few things. The photos of the place were even more impressive than the presentation. The brochure itself was glossy and professionally done. High-end marketing material. Finally, there was an invitation to spend a weekend at the farm and stay in one of their luxurious guest houses. I told Gina about the meeting and what I had seen. I said I had been waiting for the right time to tell her about it, but so far the timing wasn't right. I told her that I thought she might think I was crazy if I even thought about something like that. She said a brochure came in the mail today and she was interested. We then had a very sincere and open discussion about our work, our lifestyle, and our relationship. We really opened up to each other and it was very positive. I realized that while I was unhappy with my job, Gina hated hers. At the end of the conversation, we decided to confirm our participation in the HVF weekend in a few weeks. This decision seemed to take a huge stressful load off our esteemed backs. That evening, we made love. The mood was much less anxious and reminded me of happier times at the beginning of our relationship. The drive to Hidden Valley Farm took 4 hours. When we checked in, the house had a resort atmosphere, and we were given a key and map to our cottage. On the first evening, a relaxed reception was organized. A handwritten note lay in the great hall inviting us to the reception. The note was signed by Simon Brand, the manager. The cottage was like a suite of rooms. There was a sofa and armchairs in the main room. There was also a small dining table with wooden chairs. Lots of windows, and the walls were painted in light, bright pastel colors. The floors were hardwood. The room had a small refrigerator, counter, and kitchen utensils. The bedroom was nice, a little small, with a queen-size bed and 2 fairly roomy closets. The bathroom was amazing. All stone, tub, and separate shower, toilet, and sink, but what I liked best was the door leading to the outdoor shower. Hopefully this weekend the weather will be warm enough to use it. Maybe Gina and I could shower together. I hoped so. The reception that evening was like a cocktail party. When we checked in, we were given pre-made name tags with our names on them. The first thing we did when we got our name tags was take a picture. While taking the picture, someone brought us a drink of our choice. At this point, the hostess, Summer, an attractive and somewhat earthy woman, introduced herself and ushered us into the reception area. We were introduced to those already staying at HVF, as well as guests like us for the weekend. A nice buffet was served for the guests. Most of the food is grown here on the farm, Summer told us. After a while, you won't believe how healthy you'll feel eating toxin-free food. It's delicious and so much healthier for you, she said. She was right. The food tasted great. Maybe it was just me, but the fresh vegetables tasted better than anything we were used to. When the event was over, we walked down the stone path to our cottage. It had been a pleasant night. Since we were accompanied by Summer at the reception, we didn't have a chance to compare impressions. What do you think? I asked Gina after a few minutes. It's too good to be true, said Gina. This place seems magical. The people are nice, the food is good, and I love the little cottage they put us up in. She continued, I think I deserve this lifestyle. I pondered her words for a moment, then added, I wasn't sure what to expect, but what struck me was that all the people seemed so normal. People, whether they were regulars or guests like us, felt like people I would be friends with in any situation. I expected to see weird hippies. And these people are just like us, I told Gina. She nodded in agreement and took my hand as we approached the cottage. Although it was late evening and we had had a long day, we were both enthusiastic about the event. Gina announced that she was going to go freshen up and headed for the bathroom. I explored the cottage. Saturday morning, we had a light group breakfast in the large dining room. Fresh fruit and yogurt. A tall, smiling man walked through the hall chatting with people and shaking their hands. There was a special purity, confidence, and ease about him. Eventually, he walked over to where we were sitting. Tom January, he said, introducing himself and shaking our hands. How do you feel about this? Asked Tom to us. We told him how impressed we were and how much calmer we felt at Hidden Valley Farm. He seemed very pleased to hear our impressions of the place. So, Gina, I understand you are in retail, and Warner is the financial controller, he asked. It struck me that he knew such details about us. With great sincerity, he looked us both in the eye and said, We could really use you both here. Simon has a plan for what life should be like, and we are moving towards it. Frankly, both of your skills are needed on the farm. As he withdrew, I had an overwhelming sense of positive energy from everything I had seen. And when a guy as smart, nice-looking, and charismatic as Tom told us, he needs us, it was very flattering. When I looked at Gina, we exchanged a positive look. We were in small groups, but we had our own individual host, a guy about my age named Finn. He was pleasant and informative. We saw a huge farm and processing buildings. There was also a separate area for growing marijuana. This is allowed and legal in Oregon. There was also a large metal building where they assemble some electronics. I don't know much about it, Finn told us. Simon, because of his experience with tech, organized this about 2 years ago. All I know is that it's a profitable business that helps support our lifestyle on the farm. Speaking of lifestyle, inside was a large building with a gym, locker rooms, and hot tubs, like a high-end health club. Another interesting feature was the private beach along the river. It seemed like sand had been imported there to make it feel like a real resort. It was all very impressive. As we were leaving, Finn told us, Try to be in the dining room by 7 today. I think we're in for a surprise. That night in the dining room at dinner, we sat with another couple who had moved to Hidden Valley Farms about a year ago. They spoke only positively about their experience. They were ordinary, college-educated people from Seattle, about our age, who had given up their careers to change their lives. It was just like us. When dinner was over, the lights were dimmed, and there was silence in the large building. At one end was an elevated platform, not quite a stage, but close. A spotlight illuminated the area, and Tom Januarius appeared with a microphone in his hands. Smiling broadly, he began to speak. Everyone, welcome to Hidden Valley Farm. For our new guests who are seeing us for the first time, a special welcome. We hope you already understand what we do here. Don't think of our farm as just a place to live. Think of it as making a difference in your life. We have a plan for the future, and it may be something you choose. Tonight, you will learn a little bit more about that plan. I am pleased to introduce those who are not yet familiar with it, Simon Brand. At that moment, a thin man in his mid-40s came on stage and took the microphone. He was casually dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, curly graying hair, a beard that had grown back a few days. I couldn't help but notice the large, serious-looking man moving backstage as Simon took the stage. When I first bought this house, I wanted to slow my life down, minimize stress, and live a healthier lifestyle. I wanted to control what I ate. I wanted to get away from the toxins of our cities. Look around you, he said, gesturing with his hands. This is what I wanted for my life. And then people I knew started contacting me. They wanted the same thing. Then we came up with a plan. We had to be self-sufficient. So we grow most of our food ourselves. We found that people were willing to pay for better food, so we got a business. Since then, we've had several other businesses. We have found people who want to live here and have certain skills. We work with them to use their skills and make our farm better for everyone. This is no longer my farm. It belongs to all of you. Together, we have a plan for this farm and our lives. It may not be for everyone, but you have to ask yourself, what do you want out of your life? I have said enough. If there are questions, they will be answered at your meetings tomorrow. I ask one thing of you. As you leave this dining room tonight, listen to the sounds of the river, breathe in the fresh air, and look at the stars in the sky. Take it all in, and then decide if your current lifestyle is what you want or if you want something more. Good night. Gina and I were stunned by his words. There was more than charisma in this man. There was passion and strength in him. At that moment, I felt like I would follow him anywhere. I noticed Gina's gaze. She too was looking at him with a peculiar expression. I had seen that look before, but at that moment I couldn't realize when exactly. He's pretty impressive, isn't he? Asked me Mike, the guy from Seattle. I just nodded. We moved away from the couple from Seattle, and after a moment I asked him, "Who was that big guy on stage?" Mike looked at me confused for a moment, then said, "Oh, that's Simon's security guard. His name is Ed Gunther." He looked a little awkward talking about Gunther. The next day, our appointment was set for 9:30 a.m. We were given a brochure with information on what to expect at the meeting. The meeting was businesslike but friendly. Our representative's name was Angela, and she seemed nice. We discussed the issue and decided that we wanted to make a lifestyle change and consider moving to HVF. Essentially, you were buying stock in the farm. There was a big package of financial information. To my cursory glance, it looked pretty standard. It was legitimate equity that could theoretically be sold. Depending on how much stock you bought depended on where you would live, from a large shared dorm room to individual multi-room cabins. When we visualized how much we were willing to buy using our savings, we were able to qualify for a cottage, one just like the one we were staying in this weekend. "Can we see the specific cottage where we'll be staying?" Gina asked. Asked Gina. "Okay," replied Angela, typing in the information on her laptop. "It looks like you were staying in cottage 19B this weekend. It's a nice room with an updated bath." She continued to study the screen for another minute or so. "I'll be right back," she said, and left abruptly. We looked at each other in silence, nervous and a little embarrassed. A few minutes later, she returned with a wide smile on her face. "You're lucky," she said. 19B would have been a more expensive target for your stock, but the people who were scheduled for that block have moved to the quarters. If you'd like, but you'd better make your decision now. I can put you in 19B. Before we even had time to discuss it, Gina said, "We agree." And our path to a new way of life became certain. It was a bit of a surprise. Not that we had made such a big decision, but that Gina was so enthusiastic about it. We were both happy about it. Over the next few weeks, we were able to detach ourselves from our old lives, jobs, and commitments. One thing I needed to resolve was my house. It looked like some HVF owners had sold their homes and used that equity to buy stock. I decided not to do that. Shasta and Zeke would move into the main house. He had an apartment that he would rent out and would officially move there. Their rent would support my mortgage payment. The garage apartment would be empty for now. We left the furniture behind, so other than clothes, There was nothing to bring to Hidden Valley. 3 weeks after leaving, we returned to Hidden Valley Farm. During those weeks, we talked over all the details of life in our new home. We had a lot to go through. As we studied all the information, one thing I noticed was that most of the farm was very well organized, while some parts were completely unorganized. I shrugged my shoulders. Apparently, it's a work in progress. We learned a few more details about the Hidden Valley Farm business. It was essentially a joint venture. At the end of the year, profits were distributed. Net profits were paid out based on how much net profit was accumulated based on the number of shares you owned. You could also receive money each month that would be deducted from your annual profit share. On the first Monday after we moved in, we had a meeting with the commercial committee. This was to determine where we would work. Gina was identified to work at the Farmer's Kiosk retail store on the road to Grants Pass. Her immediate supervisor was Tom January. I was assigned to the business office to handle accounts receivable, accounts payable, and general accounting for a company I learned was called HVF LLC. My supervisor was a woman I had seen, but not yet spoken to, named April Mann. April seemed to me to be quite nice, not much of a talker and not particularly noted for her sense of humor. No nonsense, but not particularly unpleasant either. Still, Gina worked in the retail store, and I worked in the office, in the building where Simon and some of the inner circle executives apparently lived. The neighborhood was known as the Quadrant. On my first day at the office, I noticed that Claire, the wife of Mike, a Seattle couple we had met, also worked in the business office. She seemed nice and helpful. I quickly realized that the mechanics of what I was doing were pretty simple. The problem was that their system seemed disorganized and inefficient. I could help streamline that part of it once I understood a little more about how they did business. Essentially, they had 3 main lines of business: farm, retail, and wholesale. Selling marijuana wholesale and selling marijuana products. An appliance assembly business. All income went into a single general ledger. And then, well, I'll skip all the boring details. As far as I could tell, it was basic bookkeeping. After a few weeks, I saw several ways to improve the overall system. I approached April with a suggestion to streamline a few things to improve efficiency. "What specifically do you want to do?" she asked. She asked. She asked. There was an accusing look on her face. I was a little surprised. I thought she would appreciate my input and be happy that I was trying to improve the overall operation. I started to tell her how we could improve the situation, but she interrupted me. "Write a report and I'll look at it when I have time. In the meantime, keep working with Claire on what you've been told to do." I was a little embarrassed. The others in the office could see that she was speaking so dismissively to me. I was also a little angry. Why was April being such a bitch to me? I was just trying to help. Despite the weird hostility in the office, things were great with Gina and me at Hidden Valley Farm. Gina loved what she was doing, and she loved the people she worked with. The lack of stress from our previous jobs was so refreshing. The food was delicious and so healthy. We both increased our physical activity. Gina was losing weight and looked great. And they had a strange tradition at the beach by the river that we had seen on our first excursion. Our lives improved dramatically. I think several factors contributed to this. The first was less stress. We were happier more often. 2, physically we were in better shape. I felt I looked a little better, and Gina definitely looked better after she lost the weight. Those were wonderful times in Hidden Valley, and all our doubts about such a drastic change in our lives were dispelled by this healthy, less stressful lifestyle. We got on so well with each other, we both felt and looked good. I knew we were much healthier overall, and our lives were active. In the coming weeks, a series of events occurred that began to change everything. I had noted earlier that I wanted to help organize the accounting structure at Hidden Valley Farm LLC. April showed no interest in my suggestions. If I were to honestly assess my abilities as an accountant, I would say this. At best, I was an honest bookkeeper. My strength lay in organization. I could look at systems and software and figure out how to simplify their use for all parties. My technical skills complemented my abilities in this area. I knew something was wrong with the accounting system at HVF, but I couldn't yet figure out what it was. I had to tiptoe around April. Some of the details of the business she kept from me, but I knew something was wrong. One day I asked Claire about this C account I kept seeing. "What is this account?" I asked the slender, dark-haired Claire. I see income on it, but I don't see it on the balance sheet, I asked. When I brought it up, she glanced nervously across her cubicle toward April's office. Warner, she said, and shook her head negatively, all the while looking at April's open door. What? I asked, puzzled by her behavior. Just leave it alone, she whispered to me. Meh. At that moment, we heard a noise coming from April's office. Claire's strange behavior spoke of secrecy, so I went back to my cubicle and continued my work. At one point, I took my eyes off the screen and saw April leaning against the door jamb and looking at me with her arms crossed. Later that day, Claire brought me a file folder. Inside was a sticky note. Be careful, there are cameras everywhere. Destroy this note. What or who? Then I found another folder. In it was a series of requests from the IRS. Apparently, they were requesting information and had questions about our method of accounting. The IRS was asking for clarification on estimated taxes for recent quarters. It appears that some of the information was provided, but not all of it. The IRS had an agent, Damon Claiborne, who persistently pursued us. HVF LLC had so far avoided further questioning, but I could see that this Claiborne was persistent. I put it off for later. A few days later, there was a strange commotion in the representative cluster in the quad. We heard someone raising their voice and yelling at one of the executive residences. This went on for several minutes. I got up to look out the window at what was going on, but couldn't make out who was making all the noise. After a few minutes, there was a single scream that sounded like a police siren. I saw a man running down the hillside away from the quad. He was quickly followed by an automobile. I saw Ed Gunther, the big security guard, in the car and several other people. From my vantage point, I couldn't see what happened next, but I heard shouts of no, stop, and the sounds of some kind of struggle. Everyone get back to work. I looked up and saw April standing in the office with her hands on her hips. I felt like I was in an elementary school being reprimanded by the principal. After work that night, I told Gina what I had seen. She saw Gunther's black Suburban heading toward Grants Pass, followed by another HVF car. At dinner that night, we sat with Mike and Claire. We developed a friendship with them. As we sat there, Tom Januarius appeared on a small stage in the open part of the dining room. Everyone, he announced. At the end of the evening meal, please linger a little longer. Simon has a few words to say to you. It was not unusual for Simon to speak to the group during the meal, but it was unusual for January to announce that he would be speaking. The announcement took on a more serious tone. As Simon took the stage, I noticed his appearance. Worn khaki pants and a work shirt with sleeves rolled up, barefoot. The image of casualness and control. This guy had built-in charisma. With a quick glance around, I noticed all these glowing faces mesmerized by his presence, including Gina's face. I'd seen that look before. Today, he began, we had an incident on the farm. He paused, shook his head, and looked at the ground, strutting around the stage with his hands shoved in his pockets. It was as if he was trying to come to terms with something. One of our brothers was dissatisfied with something and tried to take action. Simon continued. We get help from this man. In our community, he spread his arms wide in an encompassing gesture. Harmony must reign. Sometimes one person can disrupt that harmony. I watched Simon and was mesmerized by his presence. He had a way of commanding attention. On one side of the stage, I saw Ed Gunther clasping his hands together in front of him, watching Simon and the crowd. On the other side of the stage stood an attractive blonde woman, probably in her 30s, looking at Simon. I'd seen her before, but wasn't familiar with her. When we do something, like what we're doing here, growth happens, Simon continued, spreading his arms. And with growth, inevitably comes the pains of growth. The goal here is to create an environment centered around all of our health and all of our lives. We lead this farm toward those goals. Every once in a while, not often, someone has other ideas about their individual goals and gets frustrated. It saddens me when that happens. That's when we have to make adjustments. Finally, I ask one small thing of all of you and make you a promise. I ask you to make small sacrifices for the betterment of all of us here. I promise this. If you ever have a problem with anything, we will do our best to fix it. My door is always open to all of you. If I'm not here, you can go to Tom, Ed, or April for immediate help. We have a plan, and we are moving quickly and surely in the right direction. Good night. That was it. As we got up to leave, I asked Mike, "What was that all about?" I wanted to hear what he knew. Mike just shook his head and quickened his step, moving away from the dining room. I had to almost run to catch up with him. When I caught up with him, he didn't answer any of my questions. Finally, I asked him who the blonde woman on stage was when Simon performed. "The wife," he whispered to me, after which he and Claire walked off in the direction of their cottage. What kind of wife, I wondered. The whole day passed in strange forebodings. First the incident in the quad, and then Simon's vague explanation. Gina and I discussed it, but she didn't seem all that puzzled or concerned about the day's events. I went back to work, and it was Tuesday. I knew Gina would be with the other women at the beach. That usually meant an exciting evening for us. I was looking forward to it. In the meantime, my questions about the C account continued unabated. As far as I could tell, large amounts of income were unaccounted for, and the only place they could be was in the mysterious C file. Claire knew about it, but didn't want to talk about it. Strange. Another request showed up from an IRS agent, Damon Claiborne. I couldn't figure out where we responded. That evening, Gina was in a good mood after a day at the beach. She seemed to be thinking about something. After dinner, I asked her how her day had been. "Yes, it was a good day," she said. "I really like my job at the farm store." I suggested some marketing ideas, and Tom and the others were receptive to my suggestions. She continued. "Gina, that's great. I'm so glad it's all working out," I said. "But I was wondering how it went at the beach today." "It was very different at the beach today," she said, and looked toward the river. "Really?" I asked. "Different how?" I was expecting some kind of teasing answer. "Simon showed up," she stated. "What?" I almost shouted. "Tell me what happened," I asked. "At first it was just a normal day. A group of us were enjoying the water and sunshine. I was lying on my towel, drying off after swimming. I was about to fall asleep when I heard some noises that seemed out of place." Gina continued to look out the window at the river. "I opened my eyes and saw a dressed man walking down the beach. It took me a minute to recognize him. I felt like covering myself with a towel, but there was no one else, so I didn't do that either." "Did you talk to him?" I asked. "He came over to where I was lying, squatted down and talked to me like he knew me. He knew my name, asked me how I liked it on the farm, said he'd heard good things about my work. It was flattering that Simon was so nice to me, but also strange. Another strange thing happened this week while I was at work. I was going through some income statements and saw something that I thought belonged to the C account. There was a large number, thousands, that were unaccounted for. It was quarterly tax time, and any net income had to be reported. I began to understand why this Claiborne guy from the IRS had doubts. I asked Claire, and she quickly told me that I needed to talk to April about all of this. I walked over to April's office and stood in the doorway. She was working intently on her laptop. I saw that she had her C account open on her screen and watched her log into it on her laptop. I saw the sequence of actions as she logged into the account. I also saw what file program she was using. At this point, she was completely oblivious to my observations. If I had somehow managed to find out her password, I would know how to access and copy that file. "April," I asked. I startled her. She almost jumped up. She turned away from me and closed the small top right drawer of the desk. "Jesus," she said. "What are you doing sneaking up on people? You almost gave me a heart attack." "What's the matter?" she demanded. I asked her about the C account and the quarterly taxes on that income. She gave me a long, hard stare. "I'll take care of that. You don't have to worry about all that. Just leave it alone," she told me. "But," I said, "there seems to be a lot of money coming into this account from the farm store. We have to pay taxes on that." I told her. "Leave it alone!" Now she was yelling. "I'll take care of it. Now get back to work," she shouted at me. Walking back, Claire witnessed this altercation and looked at me. I was embarrassed, but even more angry at that bitch April. Besides, I was curious. Something wasn't right here. That night I tried to talk to Gina about it and lay out my theory. She seemed withdrawn and showed little curiosity about what I was saying. When I asked her what was going on, she replied that everything was fine. This mood persisted for several days. A week or so later, she came home from work, excited about something. "Guess where we're having dinner tonight?" she announced with a smile. "In the dining room?" I replied, curious as to what this was all about. No, you and I are having dinner with Simon at his house tonight, declared Gina proudly. How did that happen? I asked. She told me that Simon and Tom January showed up at the farm store in the afternoon while she was working. Tom told me that Simon wanted to see some of the new changes. Many of the things he noted were ideas suggested by Gina. Simon spent some time with Gina and complimented her work. Then he asked her if she and I would like to attend a small dinner party tonight. We have to be there at 6:30. I need to shower and get ready. I also need to get into my packed clothes and find something appropriate, she told me. When I tried to join her in the shower, I was told to wait my turn. There was no time for an affair. It was an important night. When I finished showering, I saw that Gina was wearing a dress with a deep neckline showing off a large cleavage. The open back made it impossible to wear a bra. She looked gorgeous, but classy. I was proud to be with her. At dinner, Simon was a wonderful host. There were about a dozen people at the party, including April, who I had been avoiding. Simon approached me, and we had a nice conversation. As I had noticed, he had a lot of charisma and had a knack for making you immediately feel comfortable talking to him. Warner, I've heard great things about how you help our office. Thank you, said Simon to me. How do you and your lovely wife like living on the farm? He asked. I told him how much we were enjoying the change of lifestyle and how much better we both felt. I was enjoying the conversation, but something about him made me wary. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. At dinner, the seats were assigned, and I found myself sitting next to Ed Gunther. I noticed that Gina was sitting next to Simon. The food was excellent, and there were lively conversations around the large table. I noticed that Simon and Gina seemed to be engaged in a long and intense conversation. As we walked back to our cottage, I wanted to compare notes about the evening with Gina. We often did this after parties we attended. She seemed less engaged in the conversation. When I asked her about the conversation with Simon, she was again uncharacteristically terse. Over the next few days, she continued to remain in a quiet mood. Although we were engaged, the intimacy we had rekindled in the early days at Hidden Valley Farm was not quite the same. Meanwhile, in the office, I kept my head down, but watched April from across the room. I noticed that she regularly popped in on the C count. Once, she almost caught on to the fact that I was watching her and threw me a lewd look when our eyes met. One thing was certain. She kept her passwords in a small drawer to the right of her desk. A few days later, Gina came home from work again excited. Tom stopped by today. I have a dinner meeting tonight with Tom, some of the staff, and Simon. She chirped. We're talking about a big expansion of our retail chain, and they need my input. I'm so excited, she continued. Congratulations, I said to Gina. How long will the meeting last? I asked. I don't know, Warner. She replied with a note of irritation in her voice. I guess it depends on how much we have time to do, she replied. Attractive dress, shower, makeup again. She looked good as she set off to meet me at Simon's house. I was starting to get a strange feeling from the situation. We had spent months here, hardly ever showing our faces to Simon. He'd seen her, and suddenly she was being invited to his house twice in the last week or so. After dinner in the dining room, I decided I needed a walk to get my thoughts in order. Walking along the paths around the farm, I pondered the way things work around here. The healthy food, the stress-free lifestyle, the beautiful environment. Those are all the positives. And here are the negatives. We all work for very little pay, almost for free. Profit sharing only. The HVF LLC business was bringing in a lot of money. I wondered where it was all going. Something wasn't right. I needed to get into my C folder and see what was going on there. I started putting together a plan on how I could do that. As I walked along the ridge, I saw the truck Tom January was driving heading down the road toward Grants Pass. Perhaps their meeting was over and Gina was home. I headed back toward our cottage. By the time I got back to the cottage, it was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening. It was still light outside, but it was starting to get dark. I called out for Gina, but after glancing around our little cottage, I realized she wasn't home yet. It might not have been Tom January in the truck, but it was his truck. I sat reading for almost 2 hours before Gina showed up. During that time, my thoughts switched from jealousy to pride at how well Gina was doing, and then to the fact that I thought there was something wrong with the place, at least financially. When she finally showed up, I tried to be calm and asked her about the meeting. The meeting went well, she said. And that was all she said. She looked at me, then looked away. Something wasn't right. After she got out of the bathroom and into bed, I started asking specific questions about her evening. Who was there? How long did everyone stay? What happened? Warner, I'm exhausted. It's been a long day. Let's talk tomorrow. She tried to brush off my questions. When I didn't let her finish, she accused me of not trusting her, and the conversation went downhill after that. It was the first night since we moved to Hidden Valley Farm that we went to bed angry with each other. At lunch the next day, I went for a walk and ran into Mike and Claire on one of the farm trails. As I've learned, it's always best to have a conversation in private where there's less chance of being overheard. I walked over to them and we started talking. They could tell something was bothering me. Mike studied my face and asked, "Everything okay, Warner?" I guess I needed to talk things out. I told them about everything that had happened with Simon and Gina, how he was at the beach and how he talked to her there. I told them about our dinner at Simon's, his attentions to Gina, and the follow-up meeting I hadn't attended at Simon's last night. I told them about her acting strange and a little secretive. Is it all just me? I asked. I needed someone to look at the situation from the other side. I expected them to say it was just my imagination. At least, that's what I hoped they would answer. I watched their reactions to my words. Both looked at me, then Claire shifted her gaze to Mike. Mike averted his gaze. Neither of them spoke. After a moment, I realized they knew something but were still silent. "What?" I asked, studying their faces. Claire nodded to Mike. Mike looked around to make sure we were alone. "I'm going to tell you something, but I'll deny I ever said it if you say it again." Mike turned to me with a serious expression on his face. Then he told me the story. There was this guy he worked with on the farm named Steve Garcia. Steve and his wife Lisa had moved to Hidden Valley from Yakima shortly after Mike and Claire. They became friends. Steve had a nasty temper and was an emotional person, but at the same time, a nice guy and a good friend to Mike. Mike and Steve worked together on the farm. Steve told a similar story about suddenly meeting Simon and how he showed interest in both of them, but especially Lisa. According to Mike, Lisa was an attractive blonde. After a while, something changed. Steve became more withdrawn and seemed to sink into a somber mood. Mike tried to talk to him, but Steve wouldn't say anything. For several days, Steve would only show up at work for a few hours and then disappear. There was no official explanation for this, but there were several rumors floating around. Something about his confrontation with Simon and that it had to do with Lisa. No one else was saying anything, and asking questions or talking about the subject wasn't the best idea. "Remember at dinner when you asked who the blonde girl was on stage with Simon?" asked Mike. I nodded. "That was Steve's wife, Lisa," he told me. "That's all I know. But Warner, be careful, Gunther and that band can be rough." "Thinking about it, I haven't seen Lisa lately either," added Claire. Throwing me a brief glance, Mike and Claire quickly withdrew. I was left standing there with a lot more questions than I had before the afternoon walk. I remembered the commotion in the quad and recalled the man running away. It had to be Steve Garcia. He also had to be the brother who became miserable that Simon had talked about during dinner. That evening, Gina was in a much better mood. She revealed that she, Tom, and Simon had been discussing the expansion of their retail farm store. Business was booming at the location on Grants Pass Road. She felt honored to be part of that discussion. They embarked on a strategic plan. She couldn't stop talking about how great Simon was. She felt honored when Simon asked her opinion on various aspects of the business. They were discussing another location on the south side of Grants Pass, and she said she might be running the place. She said they asked her to come to meetings like this more often. Then she looked at me to gauge my reaction. "Are you saying there will be more evening meetings?" I asked. "Warner, as Simon said, we will all have to make small sacrifices to accomplish our farm goals. I will miss some of the evenings spent with you, but in the long run, it's for the best." She told me this with an expression of righteous pleading on her face. I knew it was pointless to argue, but based on my conversation with Mike and Claire, I also knew that I needed to pay close attention to what was going on. One more thing. I had to get my hands on that C file. Things went pretty normally for the next few days. But then one evening, Gina didn't show up after work when we usually went to the cafeteria, and Gina was gone. No messages, nothing. She just wasn't there. I was sitting with Mike and Claire. They asked where Gina was. "I don't know," I told them. I saw Claire glance at Mike and they gave me a serious look. I also noticed that a few of the people Gina worked with at the retail store were at dinner. I wondered if I should go look for her. All the cars of everyone on the farm were in the large, open, paved parking lot. We were all free to drive our cars, we just didn't do it very often. I think I only drove my car twice in the months we spent at HVF. After dinner, I went to get my car to see if Gina was at the store where she worked. Not that I was worried, but I was concerned. When I got to the parking lot, I noticed a heavy steel chain with a padlock thrown across the street. There was no way out of the parking lot. I didn't know what to do, so I went back to the cottage to wait. At midnight, I turned off the lights and went to bed. I was anxious and angry, but exhausted at the same time. I fell into a light sleep. I must not have been asleep long when I heard Gina walk in. She immediately headed to the bathroom and I heard the shower running. When she came out, I asked her where she had been. She hesitated and replied, "With Simon and some others." "What were you, Simon and the others doing until 1:22 a.m.? I asked, already fully awake. "Warner, I'm tired. Let's talk in the morning." Gina leaned back in her chair and pulled the blanket over herself. I wanted to know where she was, who exactly she was with, and what they were doing. When I started asking her all these questions, she got up, grabbed the blanket and pillow, and went to the couch in the main room. I just let her go. I knew it was the mood, and that I wasn't going to get any good answers today. I fell into a deep and restless sleep. In the morning, Gina was gone. She must have gotten up early to avoid the conversation we needed to have. Over the years of our marriage, there had been times when I had been jealous, but never once had I questioned Gina's fidelity. Now, however, I doubted it. Gina looked better than ever. I didn't blame men for being attracted to her, but when a man with a God complex sets his sights on her, he wants her. And from what I've seen, Simon usually gets what he wants. Tonight, Gina and I have a long conversation about many things, including our life at Hidden Valley Farm. The problem was that she didn't come home that evening. By midnight, I went back to bed. Waking up a little after 4 in the morning, I was convinced I was alone. I couldn't go back to sleep. All thoughts of Gina's innocence were gone. I was sure she was having fun with Simon. I began to think about various plans for the rest of my life. One thing I knew for sure: I needed revenge. Unlike Steve Garcia, I wasn't going to have a screaming confrontation. I was developing a careful plan. Key to that plan was obtaining the C file. I was certain that Simon, April, and possibly others were skimming, were transferring money into a secret account. One of the problems is that no taxes were paid on the proceeds. That's against the law. That's why this file was so secret. He was also cheating all the shareholders of Hidden Valley Farm out of a portion of the profits. That afternoon at work in the business office, I smiled, giving nothing away about my irritation over Gina's overnight absence. I needed to focus on my plan. In the afternoon, I brought Claire a file folder. Inside was a sticky note. "Meet me on the trail behind the barn at lunchtime." Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed her flinch upon discovering my note. She quickly looked back and made eye contact with me, but showed no sign of agreement. At lunchtime, I went out first and headed toward the barn. 15 minutes later, Claire and Mike showed up. "Warner, this could be dangerous," Mike said with a serious expression on his face. I ignored him and said to Claire, "This won't take long. Just tell me this. Are April's passwords in the top right drawer of her desk?" Claire stared at me and then looked at Mike, not knowing what to do. "Warner," said Mike, "that's it. We like you, and we know what you might be going through, but we have our own lives to worry about." He gave me a hard look and then nodded to Claire. "Yes," she said in almost a whisper. "Her username is a man at hvflc.com, and her password is on the yellow sheet in the top right-hand drawer." And with those words, Mike and Claire left before I could thank them. Back at the office, Claire did her best to ignore me for the rest of the day. I didn't blame her. What I was doing was serious and dangerous. I arrived at my empty cottage. It looked lonely and empty, though Gina didn't look like she'd taken anything away. I sat down in a chair and began to think about my plan, my strategy. 30 minutes later, Gina, Ed Gunther, one of Gunther's goons, and Simon showed up. I was surprised and curious as to what was going on. They all entered the main room. I stood up warily. Gina moved toward me as if wanting to hug me. I held out my hands with palms up. She stopped abruptly with a short gag in her throat, but not a sob. Her husband, The man she'd shared countless intimate relationships with had told her to stay away. Startled, she pulled herself closer to Simon, and he wrapped his arm protectively around her shoulder, and she snuggled against him. Still, not a word had been spoken. "What do you all want?" I asked calmly and nonchalantly. Inside me, everything was boiling. "Warner," Simon began, "I know this may hurt, but I have a plan. I don't want to hurt your and Gina's relationship. There is a lot of pressure on me to run our farm properly. I realize that I need Gina's advice and support. It doesn't affect your marriage. It's just that I need her right now." I stared at Simon. Ed Gunther took a half step forward, his thug standing at his shoulder. Although I would have loved to punch Simon, there was no way I could handle Gunther and his boyfriend. "Warner, I know this is all hard to take, but it's all for the good of our community. We've come up with some great plans for our retail business. This will help strengthen the farm. Gina has been instrumental in that. She is an important part of what we do here," Simon said. "And so are you, Warner. Please look at the big picture, for the good of us all." This guy was good. For a moment, I almost bought his ramblings. As he spoke, I watched Gina. I could see the tense expression on her face as she looked at him. I knew I'd seen that expression on Gina before. When had it been? Then suddenly, a distant memory came over me. She looks exactly the same way she'd looked when Reggie Lake had dragged her out of that party the first time I'd met her. Free adoration. I turned to Gina. "So you're having fun with him?" I asked. Gina gasped at my expression, and Gunther took another step forward. His physical presence was menacing, and he looked at me with undisguised hostility. Simon shook his head slowly back and forth with a half smile on his face. "Warner, I know you might be hurt by Gina's intimacy with me. I understand that. But it's only a small part of what Gina and I are working on. Yes, she's been sharing my bed." Simon nodded frankly. "But I want you not to dwell on that, but to think about your future and the future of all our brothers and sisters here in Hidden Valley. I want you to think of it as a small sacrifice you are making to make our farm a better place." I remember Simon talking about sacrifice in one of his early speeches. I guess I thought sacrifice meant working late or doing without certain material goods. I didn't realize that the sacrifice he wanted from me was to willingly let my wife do it. "Now Ed and I are leaving," Simon said. "I hope we don't have any problems. This is a good time for you and Gina to work through any pain this situation may have caused. Warner, you are important to our future. I want to sincerely thank you for sacrificing yourself for the greater good." And with those words, everyone but Gina left. As soon as they left, Gina moved toward me to give me a hug. I just stood still. I didn't put my arms out to block her, but when she hugged me, my arms hung limply at my sides. I didn't reciprocate her hug. I thought about how the first step toward the end of my marriage had already been taken. "Warner, please talk to me," said Gina. "I know you're hurting, and I know you may be angry, but this is such a small part of our lives. I expect to be back at our cottage full-time in a few weeks, and then we will live the rest of our lives together, happily, on this wonderful farm." She continued with a radiant smile. "So, for the next few weeks, as she just told me, she and Simon will continue to have fun. And she thinks I'm going to put up with that for the greater good? She's crazy." I'm not saying anything. "Warren, I love you and I love Hidden Valley Farm. Our lives are so much better here. We can help make this farm a great place for us and many others to live. Simon needs my help in expanding the farm. By expanding, we will make this farm stronger. You and I will be an important part of the future," she tells me. Either she's been practicing with Simon, or his ability to talk nonsense has been passed on to her. It wasn't a bad speech. Not that I agreed with any of it, but I had to give her high marks for effort. "I deserve this life, you. We deserve this life together," she says to me with great emphasis. In case you haven't noticed, Gina is always talking about how much she deserves different things. It's like the whole world owes her something. Without reacting to her words in any way, I told her, "I'm going to dinner," and started to walk away. She just stared at me, waiting for some kind of reaction. Anger, tears, happiness, or something else. They say the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. Even though inside I was beyond furious, I didn't let any of those emotions out. I was neutral. "Warner, wait, I'll come with you," she called out to me. I stopped and slowly turned to face her. There was an expectant half smile on her face as she looked at me. Do you really think I want to be seen with you? I said in a calm but firm voice. The whole farm knows you're having fun with the fearless leader, I tell her. I have enough dignity left to at least pretend like I don't agree with my wife sleeping with this guy. Her face is frozen with shock at my comment. There is resentment written all over her face. Clearly, she doesn't realize how effective the gossip network is at good old Hidden Valley Farm. And if you do come over, for heaven's sake, please don't try to sit with me tonight, I tell her as I leave the cottage. Surprisingly, she returned to our cottage after dinner. She alternately tried to strike up a conversation with me and cried quietly. Several times I saw her texting on the phone. Probably to Simon. Although we sleep together, there is no sex. She made a couple attempts, but my body language unequivocally said, "Keep your hands off me." This is probably the first time in our long relationship that I've turned down fun with Gina. A normal workday, and I continued to plan. I just needed the right opportunity. I completed my assignments with April, the office, and her computer constantly in mind. I needed to get my hands on that file. In the evening, Gina returns to the cottage. I expected her to be with Simon. I heard her phone ring, a text message tone. I didn't pay much attention to it, but suddenly I heard her say to herself as she studied the message, "I wonder what it's about." After a moment, I asked, "What?" She looked up, perplexed by what I had said, and then realized that I had heard her reaction to the message. "Oh, just some important meeting tomorrow afternoon," she said. When I asked a little more about it, she didn't elaborate. I needed to see the message. I needed to know if April would be at this meeting. I know the password to Gina's phone, but she always has her phone on her. Even in the bathroom. Suddenly, I had an idea. "Gina," I say, and she looks at me expectantly. "I know I've been hard on you, and I don't really like you with Simon, but I can sacrifice that for a short time. Let's make up," I asked her. She immediately hugged and kissed me. I responded, and in her mind we were on the path to reconciliation. I, on the other hand, had a goal in mind. "Honey," I tell her, "why don't you jump in the outdoor shower and I'll join you?" She nods in agreement, smiles, picks up her phone and heads to the bathroom. In the bathroom, I tell her I'm going to lock the front door and join her in a minute. I see her phone on the stone counter in the bathroom. I quickly dial the code and find her text message from Tom January. The meeting is at 2 p.m., executive office at Simon's house. I check the attendee list. Tom, Ed, Gina, Simon, and April. Yeah, I think I just found my opportunity. "Warren," she called from the shower, "where are you? What took you so long?" "On my way," I echoed. "More than likely this is my last night here. It's also more than likely the last night we'll be together. Furthermore, I wouldn't be surprised if there are a number of changes coming to this idyllic farm very soon. Of course, I'm not saying any of that. Eventually, we both fall serenely asleep. Each of us is content for different reasons. The next day, I packed my backpack. Phone, car keys, wallet, iPad, toiletries, some extra clothes I might need. Nothing obvious that would indicate I was leaving, just a few essentials. All morning at work, I'm nervous. It's hard for me to sit still. Claire notices my odd behavior, but doesn't say anything. She and Mike have been trying to distance themselves from me lately. I don't blame them. They know I'm up to something. They just don't know what it is. During my lunch break, I take a walk alone, planning. Running through my head the steps I need to take. Back at the office, I am anxiously waiting for 2 p.m. to arrive. I walk to April's office. My hands are behind my back and I lean against the door jamb. I have a series of questions for April. Nothing to do with the Secret C account. Just normal, boring accounting questions. As I continue talking, I can tell she's becoming intolerant of my harmless questioning. She glances at her watch. "Warner, it's all pretty simple. You need to know these things. I have to fly out for a meeting. In the meantime, if you have any more questions, see Claire," says April to me. As she packs up her laptop to leave for the meeting, she doesn't notice that I've taped a piece of heavy-duty clear tape to the strike plate on the door frame. If my plan works, the deadbolt won't latch when she closes the door. I've seen her adjust the internal lock button on the door dozens of times as she leaves and closes it. I know what she'll do. When she closes the door, I lean against it, continuing to ask made-up questions to keep her attention on the door latch. I push the door against the jamb and it feels locked. She walks away quickly. "Have a good meeting," I say after her as she walks away. She doesn't respond. I wait a minute to make sure she hasn't forgotten anything. Then I quickly get into motion. I stand up, look into Claire's eyes, and put my finger to my lips. A sign of silence. I hear her sigh as I open April's unlocked door. I peel off the tape. I open the top right drawer. I boot up her desktop and enter her username and password from the desk drawer. Interestingly, her password is April plus Simon forever. I quickly grab the flash drive and move it to the C folder. Then I start the download. There is a lot of data here. It will take some time to download everything onto the flash drive. I'm nervous. While all this is going on, I walk out of April's office. Claire looks at me with fear in her eyes. I just shake my head. One of the others, Belinda, walks into the accounting office and starts chatting with Claire. Nothing urgent, just a midday break to talk. I have to get her out of there. Finally, I ask Claire for help, and that prompts Belinda to leave. I quickly run into April's office and see that the file is fully loaded. When I look up, Belinda has already returned to Claire's desk. Seeing me in April's office, she gives me a puzzled look as if to say, "What is he doing in there? That office is off limits." Belinda hurries back to her office. I whisper to Claire, "Give me a head start, but you have to report me." She shakes her head, not understanding. "Belinda will report it. You need to too, or you'll look complicit," I tell her. I say a silent, "Thank you," and walk out the door. My backpack is on my back, and I want to look like I'm jogging, not sprinting. That would look suspicious. I get to the parking lot and again see the chain lying across the road. I quickly look around the area around the parking lot and see that there is no way for the car to get out. Shit. My only option is to run. I know it's 22 miles to Grants Pass, and I know there are a number of trails in the Greenbelt that can be used to get there. I've run on some of them. I'm hitting the road. Fortunately, in the months we've spent at Hidden Valley Farm, I've done a lot of running. I'm in much better condition now than when we were in Portland. I've run 2 marathons before, so I'm confident that I can cover 22 miles. I also know that I probably don't have more than half an hour left before they send out a search party. After almost 3 hours, I get to Grants Pass and find the bus station. Still no sign of the search party. A bus leaves in 20 minutes, but it's headed for Sacramento. I buy a ticket and get on. It is late when I arrive at the Sacramento bus station. I find a cheap and seedy motel and stay there. The next morning, I call my cousin Shasta in Portland. I try to explain what's going on, but she doesn't understand. It's complicated, and Shasta isn't the sharpest tool, but she wants to help. I tell her I need to go back to Portland. She's working, and there's no way she can carve out the time to drive 12 hours to Sacramento and 12 hours back. I don't blame her. She says she's going to talk to Zeke, her boyfriend, to see if he can help. Turns out a few of Zeke's buddies are in Reno and heading north. As a favor to Zeke, they agreed to pick me up in Sacramento and drive me to Portland. I thanked Shasta fervently and mentally figured that every negative thought I had ever had about Zeke had been washed away. I had to spend another night in a cheap motel. I was still nervous about my escape from Hidden Valley. I lay low and barely left the motel room. Checking my phone, I received messages from Gina. "Where are you?" And "Did you leave the farm?" As well as, "I miss you." And finally, "Everyone's looking for you." Wow. I can only imagine the reception. Zeke's friends show up. 3 of them, all in helicopters. Robert, Banjo, and Haas. You can imagine. Black leather jackets, long beards, heavy and lacking in hygiene. But I was still happy to see them. I needed to get home. Whoever was looking for me would hardly think of me in this crowd. I recognized them a little as we drove north to Portland. As different as they were from me, they turned out to be pretty good guys, and a lot smarter than I'd realized. It just goes to show you can't judge people by their looks. And that goes for Simon, too. During the long drive home, I started thinking more about Simon and the farm. Okay, he bought the land and set it up. That's understandable. But people like us who bought shares, in my estimation, grossly overpaid for what they got. Almost like a timeshare. Then Simon had all these people, residents who essentially became free labor. They paid Simon to live there and do the work. I know there was a profit share, but it was minimal. And then what I think was happening was that he was transferring cash, which was untraceable, into this C account and then hiding it. most likely overseas. Apparently, April and possibly Tom January were involved. From what I'd seen in just a few months, there had to be millions in the account. In the evening, we drove to Portland. Me, Hoss, Banjo, and the whole gang went to my house. Shasta and Zeke were there. We ordered pizza for me and lots of beer. Shasta had a lot of questions. Where is Gina? What happened at the commune? Her description, but actually pretty accurate. What are my plans? I didn't want to go into details just yet. I was still going through the sadness of my marriage likely breaking up, the anger at Simon and some of the people at Hidden Valley Farm, and the betrayal from Gina. I've never been more certain of the direction my life will take in the near future. At least for now, I would be living in a garage apartment. That night before I went to bed, I hid the flash drive in a secret, safe place in the garage. It is located in a small hole under the foundation block. I had yet to warn Shasta and Zeke about the possibility of running into the Hidden Valley people. Most likely Ed Gunther. The next day I get up and make a to-do list. Find a divorce lawyer, contact Damon Claiborne at the IRS, and try to contact Steve Garcia, Mike's friend who disappeared from the farm after the confrontation with Simon. I look out the window. Shasta is home. I think I should let her know of any potential problems if Gunther shows up. I call her, and during our conversation, I see Gunther's Suburban pull up in my driveway. He must have been watching the house. On the phone, I tell Shasta, hide somewhere in the house. One of the farm assholes just pulled up. There might be trouble. She asks me questions as I hang up the phone. I have to make sure Gunther doesn't bother her. I meet Gunther and his two guys in my driveway. You're on private property. Get out of here, I tell him. You can see Gunther is pissed off. He heads straight for me, and the other two split off on either side. They've done this sort of thing before. Gunther pulls out a stun gun and fires a charge at me. With a loud scream, I fall to the ground. When I come to, I find myself ducked taped to a wooden chair in the garage. Gunther and his goons are already there. This is much more serious than I thought. Where's the goddamn file? He asks. I answer nothing, and the guy on my left punches me in the jaw with his fist. I see stars and I'm dazed. This could be easy, or it could be hard. You decide for yourself. The bald asshole tells me. My boys hope you choose the hard way. They haven't gotten much exercise lately. He says something between a frown and a smirk. I got nothing, I tell him. Smash. I get hit by another guy. My mouth is bleeding and I've lost a few teeth. Gunther tells one of the guys to get something from the car. I'm in deep shit. But then I remember what's going on at the farm, and determination comes back to me. The thug comes back with a canvas sack. Gunther looks inside, rummages around, and then pulls out an ugly tool. Something like a wire cutter with sharp, wide jaws. I'm more than startled. For the last time, Mr. Accountant, where's the file? I can see beads of sweat on his bald head. I'm too scared to speak. Grab his left hand, Gunther says to one of the thugs. I clench my fist, but the guy effortlessly releases my pinky finger. Grabbing the tip, Gunther maneuvers the jaws of the tool on either side of my left pinky. Then he presses the blades together. A white-hot pain flashes through my head for a moment, and then I must have passed out. I wake up screaming in pain. My pinky finger lies in a bloody puddle on the floor. That's one, says Gunther. We have 9 more, and then we can start on the other, more sensitive body parts. One of the assholes chuckles. Now, Mr. Accountant, you're going to have a hard time doing your job without fingers, Gunther says in a sing-song voice. And then in a much more angry tone. Where the hell is that file? I can't even speak. So intense is the pain. If I could at this point, I would tell him. The thug grabs my hand and straightens my next finger. Gunther looks at me, shakes his head, and begins to manipulate the cutter. At that moment, there is a loud noise outside. A vibration swept through the small garage. It was the rumble of numerous Harleys. Gunther drops the tool, reaches for his shoulder holster, and with a movement of his hand, signals the other two to disperse. They look at Gunther for direction. The door swings open and Zeke, Banjo, and 5 others burst into the apartment. Gunther and his boys have their guns at the ready. The motorcyclists have guns too. I'm in so much pain I barely know what's going on. All I know is that Zeke and company have arrived just in time to save at least one more of my fingers from coming off. Gentlemen, Gunther begins with a nervous smile. It looks like we're having a bit of a standoff. Gunther is clearly outnumbered, 7-3. Mister, I suspect we can work something out, Zeke says, looking intently at Gunther. Gunther seems to relax a little. Hoss, Zeke commands sharply, not taking his eyes off Gunther. There is the sound of a gunshot, and then a bullet hole appears in the middle of Gunther's forehead. For a moment he stiffens with a surprised expression on his face, and then falls over. All of the boys' guns are now pointed at Gunther's men. Both thugs' hands fly upward in a sign of surrender. Drop your weapons, Zeke orders. And they drop them. Several things are happening now. I am incredibly hurt, but at the same time I am overwhelmed with relief at this turn of events. At this point, I'm almost unconscious. Shasta bursts in and wants to take me to the hospital. Zeke refuses. We can't have anyone investigating what happened here, says Zeke. We'll get Warner fixed up. Then we need to get rid of all of this. He tells her, glancing around the room. Zeke's guys packed up the body and the other two guys in a businesslike manner. Everything went into the Suburban. The 3 Harleys followed the Suburban relentlessly, heading east. I later learned that Gunther's body and the 2 guys had disappeared. The Suburban was sent to a repair shop. The VN had been completely wiped off. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. A few days later, Zeke asked me if I wanted my share. A share? A share of what? I asked. It turned out that between Gunther, his 2 goons, and what they got for the Suburban, there was about $30,000 profit on the whole thing. I gave up my share and asked Zeke to split it between Robert, Hoss, and Banjo. I also told him how grateful I was for his help. True, I lost a finger, but as Zeke told me, most of the guys he works with have less than 10 fingers left. I'm not sure if this was a club I was happy to sign up for. One of the guys, certainly not a doctor, was struggling to set my hand where a finger had been severed. Fortunately, Gunther's instrument had sharp blades. The cut came out clean. It didn't look too grotesque. After a few days of recovery, I had a job to do. I was confident that no one else at HVF would have a problem, at least not yet. Monday morning, I contacted the IRS office where Damon Claiborne worked. He wasn't in, but through his secretary, she set up an appointment for me to meet with Claiborne on Wednesday at 11 a.m. That afternoon, on a borrowed Harley, I traveled to Yakima. I learned that Steve and Lisa Garcia were now living in Salah, not far from Yakima. They were the same Steve and Lisa that were at Hidden Valley Farm. I didn't give them any advance notice of my arrival. I had never met any of the Garcias. I had been warned about Steve's temper. It was a small house on a dusty street. There were no sidewalks. There was a pickup truck in the driveway. With a bandage on my left arm, I walked over and knocked on the door. It opened quickly, and before me stood a dark-haired man in his 30s, in need of a shave. Although I had never met him at Hidden Valley, I recognized Steve Garcia. "Can I help you?" he said. Not outright hostility, but far from a friendly attitude either. "My name is Warner West," I begin, and realize I need to proceed with caution. I was in Hidden Valley FA. "Get out of here!" He explodes at the mention of Hidden Valley Farm. "Steve, you've got it all wrong." I raised my hand. "Gunther and his boys did that to me," I tell him hastily. "I left there last week. Simon took my wife," I quickly add. The door was inches away from closing when my words caught his attention. He invited me in. I told him my story. I left out the part about Zeke getting rid of Ed Gunther and company. I told him how it all started with Simon's interest in Gina, with all his nonsense about self-sacrifice and the good of the farm. It seemed he'd heard it all before. I had to be careful gathering information from Garcia. He could quickly launch into a long, incoherent diatribe about killing them all, burning everything to the ground, and slowly strangling Simon. I was angry at Simon and what had happened, but Garcia was on another level of anger. "So, what are we going to do?" His dark eyes focused on me as he asked the question. I started telling him about possible tax evasion, legal channels, and maybe some type of negotiated settlement. "Bullshit!" he intervened. "I want to destroy that goddamn Simon!" We discussed the concept. Garcia was rational enough to realize that he could never sneak onto the farm and get close enough to Simon to exact revenge. I talked him out of mass destruction at the farm. There are too many good people there. He reluctantly agreed. I decided I had to go. I got the information I needed from Steve, and his hostility was starting to bother me. If you ever hear about this asshole anywhere away from this goddamn farm, let me know, said Steve to me as I left. I assured him I would. On Wednesday, I was supposed to meet with Claiborne, the IRS agent. Throughout the time after leaving Hidden Valley Farm, I continued to receive emails from Gina. The tone of them was as if she believed I was coming back, like I was on a business trip. She also kept me in the loop, as if I was still interested in the success of the farm and Simon's grand plans. I answered briefly, if at all, but wanted to keep that channel of communication open. Exactly on Wednesday, I was at the IRS office in downtown Portland. I had showered, shaved, and was dressed in clean business clothes. My mental image of an IRS employee was a stout, middle-aged white guy, balding, wearing a brown suit. I was surprised when I met Claiborne. Damon Claiborne looked to be in his early 30s, probably 5 feet tall, athletic build, wearing a strict dark suit, dark-rimmed glasses, and a neatly tied tie. He was also African American, and he looked very serious. Good. He greeted us in a business-like manner and started a conversation. He asked me about my relationship with Hidden Valley Farm, and in particular, the HVF LLC business. I told him the whole story. There was no mention of my injured hand. That's all well and good, Mr. West, but we already know most of what you told me about the business, said Claiborne. I need proof. And I held out the flash drive to him. Now I had his attention. I explained what it was and where it came from. He asked if I could wait while he and his team studied my information. I agreed. It was probably 2 hours later when a smiling Damon Claiborne brought me back to his office. Thank you, Mr. West, for this information. The IRS Criminal Investigations Division is conducting criminal investigations into alleged violations of the IRS Code, the Bank Secrecy Act, and anything related to money laundering. At this point, if there is evidence, we refer the case to the Department of Justice. Now, thanks to your help, we have that evidence, Claiborne explained. Are you prepared to testify in court? He asked me. I nodded affirmatively. Mr. West, are you familiar with federal compensation for whistleblowers under the False Claims Act? Asked Claiborne. I replied that I had heard of it, but didn't know how it worked. Mr. West, let me explain. When a person provides information that helps the government recover funds from companies or individuals who have committed fraud, they are entitled to a reward of up to 25% of the recovered funds. He says to me, I have filed a pre-application on your behalf for a refund of funds received from HVF LLC, including money transferred to an offshore account through File C. Thank you, I tell him. No, Mr. West, thank you, he says, and extends his hand for a handshake. So now the wheels are in motion. I wonder what will happen next, I think, as I walk out of the IRS office. I ask him, what's next? He is a little wordy about their plan of how to proceed. He tells me the following. It will happen quickly, I assure you. I go to a divorce attorney, and he suggests a prenuptial agreement. I offer Gina all of my shares of Hidden Valley Farm, and she in turn relinquishes any claim to my other assets. Other than the house I owned before the marriage, there are no assets. There will be no downside for Gina. Of course, she will not find out about any reward for informants. I also made an appointment with my bank and got a small loan secured by the house. Working capital. I gleaned information from the news, Gina's emails, and the small pieces of information offered by Damon and the IRS. Here's what seemed to have happened. Somehow Simon learned of the federal raid on Hidden Valley Farm before it happened. He and Gina fled to Ecuador. Ecuador is a country that does not have a strong extradition relationship with the U.S. The feds arrested Tom in January and April as officials of HVF LLC. They seized computers and searched the premises. Residents were given a week to leave the premises. The business was frozen. All assets, including part of the C account in the Cayman Islands, were seized. To my surprise, I started receiving emails from Gina. She asked if I had anything to do with the raid, and I told her, of course not. In her emails, she spoke of the Fed raid as a short-term setback. She fully expected that Hidden Valley Farm would soon be up and running with Simon in charge. She talked about his genius, his talent, what a special person he was. She said she was honored that she and Simon had a close friendship. I talked about getting married after the nuptials. I suggested that, given her close relationship with Simon, wouldn't it be better for the good of the farm if she managed our shares? I waited for her answer. In the meantime, I had some business with Zeke. I asked him about forged documents, how much it would cost, and if he had access to such things. For a good ID, driver's license, passport, you'll have to pay $10,000, Zeke told me. $10,000, I think. How long will it take? I ask. About a week after we get the picture, he replies. Later that day, I call Steve Garcia on the landline. I tell him I have some news for him. Also, could he please stop by Walgreens and get his passport photos taken and mail them to me? Surprisingly, he agrees without further question. Finally, I get an email response from Gina. She has discussed the prenup with Simon, and he agrees that she should own the stock. She is ready to sign the document. I tell her that in order for the document to be official, it needs to be notarized. This means she must get a hard copy, sign it, have it notarized, and then return it to me. After a few days, I was successful. She sent me an address in Ecuador. They live in the city of Cuenca. I mail the document to Gina. The next day, having become 1,000 people poorer, I receive Steve Garcia's fake ID. His new name is Oscar Lindar. For another $2,000, Zeke's accomplice will deliver a package to a certain address in Selah, Washington. The package contains a fake ID, a used passport, a driver's license, and several inactive credit cards. There's also $5,000 and an address in Cuenca, Ecuador. Garcia will understand. The rocket was launched. Now I had some free time. I contacted Damon Claiborne, and he informed me that my application for a whistleblower reward had been approved. He explains that the government, long known for its slowness, has favored quick, decisive action in such circumstances. But we still have to wait, he tells me. Damon, I have a suggestion for this award. Could we get the people who end up signing it together for a brief meeting? I have an idea, I tell him. He says he'll work on it. 2 days later, his secretary asks me to be in the 4th-floor conference room of the federal building at 10 a.m. on Friday. I agree. It's been almost a week since the package for Garcia was delivered. I haven't heard anything. I got an email from Gina. Same old bullshit. Simon is a genius. He finds her interesting. Hidden Valley Farm is about to be better than ever, and she can't wait to meet me. Friday morning, I'm at the federal building. I have the paperwork in a folder. Hopefully, I will be able to present this information. I am ushered into a large conference room and receive a warm handshake from Damon. He introduces me to his boss, Karen Natalie, and another gentleman, Chris Waverly. Damon talks about what I did to help with the Hidden Valley case. Mr. West, thank you for your help, says Karen to me. We couldn't have done it without you. I see that your reward has already been signed, so you should feel good about that. I nod my head in agreement with her words. The thing is, she continued, it can take years to pay these rewards. We seized the property and the federal government now owns the farm, but as for the bank accounts, especially the overseas ones, it will be months or even years before that is settled, she tells me. I tell her I understand all that, but I have a suggestion for the IRS. She nods for me to continue. As I understand it, the remuneration can be up to 25%. Is that correct? I ask. Karen nods affirmatively. I am offering as a reward 25% of what used to be Hidden Valley Farm, I say. That's my offer. I then hand out documents to each of them. They take a few minutes to study my offer. Because of my knowledge of the farm and income, I have highlighted the most profitable quarter of the farm. Of course, they don't know that. This area contained a deluxe cabin and 7 cottages like the one Gina and I were staying in. It was also where the best fields for growing produce were located. I watched the 3 of them consider my proposal. Damon nodded his head as if agreeing with me. Karen looked up and was at a loss for words for a moment. Well, Mr. West, this is certainly a unique idea. I can't say I've seen anything like it before, she said. We'll have to discuss it all with the others, but honestly, I think it would be acceptable. Give me a week and I'll give you an answer, she says. That concludes the meeting. I'm optimistic, but I don't want to celebrate just yet. Damon explained that the U.S. government is trying to expedite some things, and that might work in my favor. The other part was that once my 25% farm is up and running, we will start paying taxes on the profits. The IRS likes it when they can collect taxes. With the frozen property, they don't get any taxes right now. They need to be incentivized. On Sunday night, the news comes out. Leader of controversial commune found murdered in Ecuador. The following news report outlines what is known so far. Simon Brand, 48, was found dead in a villa in Cuenca, Ecuador. According to local police, the suspect died during the trial. There was another unnamed woman in the villa who was reportedly unhurt. The suspect's name has not been released by police. The investigation is ongoing. Wow. I'm stunned. Yes, I was involved in organizing this case. I just didn't think it would happen so fast. I felt really bad for Steve Garcia. Even though I didn't know him well, I could understand what he was going through. I didn't want him to die. I started getting emails from Gina. They are long and rambling, talking about the senseless death of such a brilliant man. She writes about her sadness and how a part of her died with Simon. I don't answer her letters anymore, but they continue anyway. On Friday, I get a call from Damon Claiborne with good news. The IRS has conditionally accepted my offer. There was a mountain of paperwork to be done, and I would have to meet with the appropriate county staff at the farm next week to go over the assets. It will take time for my proposal to become official, but the wheels are already in motion. I thank Damon. Warner, I'm the one who should be thanking you. It's because of this that I got the promotion. I couldn't have done it without your help, says Damon to me. Damon, if there is anything I can do for you, please let me know, I say. You know, Warner, he says, I may have to agree with you. He says, and we part ways. Wow, what a few months this has been. I've been working with Josephine County for months. Even though the government strives for efficiency, it takes time to get all the legal documents in order. It seems like a long time ago when Gina and I first heard about Hidden Valley Farm. We met a lot of good people at the farm. I quickly think back to Mike and Claire. I remember the great food and the healthy lifestyle. I remember how close Gina and I were during our first few days there. And then I think of the negative moments. April's trouble in accounting, Ed Gunther and his goons, their devious way of getting all of our labor force for minimum wage. And most of all, how Simon seduced Gina with his flattery and charisma. He'd ruined our marriage just because he wanted to entertain Gina. I blamed her too. She was attracted to the type. I should have remembered Reggie Lake and how she was with him. I thought all those years with Reggie was just an immature infatuation. I guess it wasn't just Reggie. And to think that I would put up with her infidelity. No way. I wondered about that. I also wondered if I could recreate Hidden Valley Farm 2.0. I thought that with a little help, I could do it. Many months later, Hidden Valley Farm 2.0 was doing great. It was smaller, but we were growing and selling our produce. I took a previously uncultivated slope and planted vines. It would take a few years, but in the future we would grow wine grapes. I had other ideas and discussed them with some of the managers. Mike and Claire came back. Mike ran the farm operations and Claire ran the business office. Finn and Summer, our original guides, were also back. They were in charge of marijuana cultivation and production. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from Damon Claiborne. We exchanged pleasantries, and I told him about what was going on at the new farm. I asked how he was doing and what was going on with the business. That was one of the reasons I called, he told me. Have you had any contact with Gina? He asked. Gina. Once in a while by email, but that's it. I don't even know where she lives. Last I heard, it was Ecuador, I told Damon. Why? I asked him. Let's put it this way, he said. There's a large amount of money from an offshore account that's unaccounted for. The last thing we could trace was that Simon kept it in Ecuador, but apparently he's gone, and that leaves Gina as the most likely person to know about it. He continued. I promised that if I had any contact with her, I would let him know. That was the end of it. There were about 10 other people working and living at HVF 2.0. Claire, Mike, and I decided to reopen the retail business. It was a profitable part of the old HVF business, and we all thought it was a good way to increase revenue. We began interviewing candidates for the position of retail grocery store manager. One of the residents, Angela, from the original HVF, screened candidates and scheduled interviews. The interviews were conducted by me. Several people came in, and one or two seemed qualified. When I got to the last interview, it was a familiar face. Gina. I was more than surprised to see her. It had been many months since I had last seen her, and she still looked good. I looked at her with a mixture of lust, sadness, and anger. I kept my emotions under wraps. When she reached out to me for a hug, I shook her hand in surprise. She looked surprised and embarrassed by my coolness. We sat down and began the interview. Before we begin, I said, I have to make a quick phone call. Excuse me for a moment. I smile quickly. I return and we begin. I apologize for the formality, but I tried to do things a little differently this time, I say with a disarming smile on my face. I hope you won't mind if I record this, I say. Oh, Warner. She smiles and says, Go ahead and record it if you need to. She shakes her head and smiles as she says this. Okay, let's get started. I say, Tell me why you think you'd fit in with us. And begin the interview with Gina, as I had with any of the previous interviewees. Everything was being recorded. Indeed, Warner. She looked at me almost in amazement. You know I'm in retail. I used to run a store and we've had tremendous growth. I have great ideas on how to grow our business and become more profitable. I know the products and the fundamentals of the business. Without false modesty, I doubt you could find anyone more qualified, she told me. I nodded silently, digesting what Gina had said. There was a lot of good in her words. Besides, Warner, I believe I'm destined to be here. I think this is our chance to start over. I know things didn't go right before with Simon and everything, but we've been through it all before. I can really see a future where you and I will have a wonderful life. I've never been so sure of anything in my life, she told me. And there are other ways I can help, she tells me. I throw a perplexed look at her, as if to say, Go on. Financially, she tells me with a secret smile on her face. Don't ask yet, she tells me. I nod at her, puzzled by this statement. And Warner, I never stopped having feelings for you. I'm still in love with you. I think you'll find that I've changed for the better. Simon helped me, and now I want you and I to share those positive feelings. I know, she said with a slight smile. We're going to take our time. But you know we are meant to be together, she concluded, looking at me with a very sincere look. At this point, we were interrupted. Angela informed me of an urgent phone call. I apologize and bow out. I quickly make my way back. The call was from Damon. I needed to give him an hour. Gina, we're almost done with the interview, I say. But you have me intrigued? Tell me about this financial aid thing, I ask. And she tells me a little about what happened in Ecuador. The day Simon died, Gina was at the market getting groceries. She was in the kitchen putting out the groceries when she heard the noise and screams. She was petrified and hid in the bedroom closet. She stayed that way in the closet. Then she heard gunshots and more commotion. It just so happened that there was a large canvas bag with money in the safe in the closet. Simon wanted to minimize any electronic traces, and they paid for everything in cash. Simon transferred money from accounts in the Cayman Islands. It was over $500,000. Despite her fear and apprehension about being murdered, Gina had the good sense to take the money. I deserve this money, she told me. And we can use it to help with the new store, she adds. I see, I say. Well, we can certainly discuss this further. In the meantime, I want to give you a little tour of what we do here, I tell her. She smiles and cheers as we tour the farm grounds. I try to slow things down. Damon needed an hour. At one point, she takes my hand, like we're still a couple. I get the urge to wave her off, but for my purposes today, I don't. Finally, we make our way back to the office. In the parking lot, I see a newly parked black sedan. Gina and I walk into my office and sit down. For a few moments, I sit looking at her and gathering my thoughts. Gina, I've been interviewing all day and I still wasn't sure who was right for the position. But after talking to you, I've made my decision, I said. Good, great, she said, with a wide, expectant smile on her face. I took a deep breath and told her, My new retail store manager will be Christy Freris. She was my first interview of the day. What? Gina said. I don't understand. Didn't you hear what I said? I'm supposed to be here, she continued. She was starting to get angry. Is this some kind of joke? She asked. No, not a joke, I reply. She sits there, stunned, her smile gone, looking at me. Finally, she gathers her strength. Can you at least give me some explanation? Her voice has become more hostile. She's starting to get angry. I sit back and stare back and think. Yes, I think I can explain, I say. I'll quote, there should be harmony in our society. Sometimes one person can disrupt that harmony. At that point, the community must make adjustments. She just stares, realizing where the quote came from. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get on with my day, I say. But there is someone here who needs to talk to you, I tell her. After that, Damon Claiborne and the county marshal walk into my office. Gina West, Damon says. My name is Damon Claiborne with the IRS. I need to talk to you about some missing assets. Please come with me, he tells her. As they walk away, I say, Damon, and he looks up. Then I toss him the recording device. He nods his thanks, leading a crying Gina away behind him. For half a minute, a feeling of regret overwhelms me. Then I shake my head and think, no, I made the right decision. I've never been so sure of anything in my life. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.